successful and a holding against at all times.
Be careful.
Government officials insist that this is an isolated incident of the packet for him.
Rain fell like it had something to prove. Cold. Relentless. Washing the blood off a country that could never get clean. It was the late 1500s in the Rhineland, a place where faith and fear slept in the same bed, and the devil was everyone's neighbor. Bedburg was a quiet town once. Fields of rye, church bells, and simple sins. Then the killings started. Something was tearing the life out of people. Children vanished. Pregnant women found ripped apart in the fields. The livestock were half-eaten. The rest left as a warning. The people whispered about wolves, but wolves didn't do this. Wolves didn't hunt with intent. That's when they found him. Peter Stumpp. A farmer. A widower. A man who looked ordinary enough to blend into a crowd. But behind those eyes, the story said something howled. They said he made a deal with the devil. That he wore a belt black as midnight, forged in hell itself, that turned him into a beast when the moon came up. He confessed to it all, they said. The killings, the black magic, even the taste of flesh. The kind of confessions you only make when the rack has had its say. October 31st, 1589. Halloween before there was one. They tied him to the wheel, ripped the skin from his bones with red-hot pincers, broke every limb, and burned what was left. His daughter and mistress died beside him. When it was all over, they nailed a wolf's head to the town gate as a warning. But it wasn't a warning. It was a mirror. Because Bedburg wasn't just killing a man. It was feeding a story. One that would outlive them all. A story that still howls through the centuries. They called him the Werewolf of Bedburg. But maybe the monster wasn't Peter Stumpp at all. Maybe it was the thing inside everyone who watched him burn and felt safer because of it.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Dancing Toaster. This is Pastor Nelly, and this is our 41st episode. And this October, we're celebrating a full year of the podcast. Today, we're off to Bedburg, Germany, to examine one of the darkest and most famous werewolf cases out there. Last week, we covered the South End werewolf. Wait a minute. That was a wet blanket, sir. What are you talking about? First, don't take my line. Second, I felt duped in South End. He wasn't no werewolf. You said he never even transformed. He was just alone. I felt totally robbed. Weren't you listening to the intro just now? I'm trying to remedy that today. Yeah, we'll see. I learned not to get my hopes up. Well, this case is really dark. Some of the details we're gonna hope are not true, but what do you mean you don't want to get your hopes up? Well, you see, me and Uncle Sal was talking about the show, and he said, I thought that Pastor Weirdo believed in all this stuff. Why is he debunking everything? Well, I'm glad to hear that Uncle Sal listens to the show as well, Vinny, but my goal is not necessarily to prove or debunk anything. I've said before, I believe in the possibility of almost all the things we cover on the show, but my aims ultimately are the truth and the ability to give people biblical explanations for extraordinary phenomena. I admit that sometimes that may involve explaining some of those things away. Dr. Heiser used to do the same thing on his show, Fringe Pop 321. If there's room and reason to consider the supernatural, we can, and I think we should. But if there is a logical explanation for something, if we care about the truth, we gotta be willing to entertain that as well. I'll give you an example of one of my favorite episodes of Fringe Pop 321. Dr. Heiser, of course, did believe in the supernatural. He was famous for it. He believed in the Nephilim and the giants. But on one episode, he talked about the Cyclops. Oh, didn't they prove they existed on some island or something? Well, that's what he was examining. In ancient Sicily, long before anyone knew what fossils were, people stumbled upon these massive skulls buried in caves and hillsides, remnants of creatures that had walked the island long before their arrival. These were the skulls of extinct dwarf elephants. To the untrained eye, they didn't look like elephants at all. The bones had withered with time, the tusks often missing, and in the center of each skull was a large dark hole where the trunk was once attached. To those early Sicilians, it looked like a single giant eye socket staring back at them. The conclusion came naturally. They must have been the remains of Cyclops, the one-eyed monstrosities of legend who forged thunderbolts for Zeus and who haunted the caves of Mount Etna. The myth of the Cyclops wasn't born from imagination alone. It appears to have been carved from the earth, perhaps no more than a misunderstanding of ancient bones.
Yeah, thanks a lot. You ruined Cyclops and werewolves in less than a week.
Well, it's probably something you should have stopped believing in like 30 years ago, so I'd say you're a little late either way.
Both of you, chill out. I didn't say I didn't believe in Cyclops or that they never existed, but what we thought was evidence turned out to be something else entirely. In some of our recent cases, when we dug a little bit, we found out they weren't rooted in reality. I've proven the possibility for ghosts in other episodes, but that doesn't mean every story about ghosts is true. That's what I like to do. If it's bunk, we enjoy some folklore and we move on. If there's some meat on the bone, we sink our teeth in and we attempt to find a biblical way to approach it.
Do you think that analogy is entirely appropriate given today's subject matter?
Ooh, fair point, Doc. As you could tell from the intro, things are gonna get a little spicy today, allegedly.
Just tell me now, is this a real werewolf or not?
Well, if you asked the people of Bedburg in the 1500s, they would have said yes.
Well, if you ask me, I'd say no.
Well, nobody's asking you, pencil neck.
Look, calm down, Vinny. Let's get through some thank yous and take a closer look at the evidence and see where it all leads. All right?
All right.
Thank you for all those who answered the call last week and got some reviews in. I really appreciate it. If you haven't done so, please do so. For those commenting on the Haunted Amsterdam episode, when it was initially uploaded, there was a problem with the audio. I am really sorry. It was fixed a few hours later, but it may require you to delete and re-download the episode. Again, I'm sorry. The problem was with my recording software. Thankfully, it was a relatively quick fix without having to re-record or reproduce the whole thing, but unfortunately, it hurt the episode really bad from a metrics perspective because the first download was garbage. But I've tested it just about everywhere and it has worked. So if anybody's still having issues, try the delete and re-download approach. If not, hit me up, thedancingtoasterpodcast@gmail.com. Let me know what platform you're trying to use and we'll see what we can do. Now it's time to thank the Toasties. These are, of course, my patrons on Patreon. They make this show possible, and I'm so grateful for their support. If you are a Toastie and you want to keep supporting the show, please go check your payment methods. I've had several cancellations of late, but only one of them was someone who actively canceled. The rest are simply cards that need to be updated. I'm not blasting anybody out by name here, just a friendly reminder. It's typically one of those things that you set and forget. If you want to keep supporting my work, do me a favor, double check the payment method on your Patreon account. I'd really appreciate it. Every little bit helps. If you want to join them and help me do what I do, $5 a month, help support my work, get you early access to content, you get ad-free listening, which is a big one, and you get access to exclusives, specifically a new show launching right around the corner, The Toaster Files. If you can't support monthly or you feel led to support another way, head on over to buymeacoffee.com/The Dancing Toaster. If you prefer PayPal, you can do that as well. Those of you that gave last month have no idea what it meant to my family. Not to get too personal or too sentimental, but the support I get from my listeners is literally the difference between us making it and not making it up here in the Pacific Northwest. So again, I thank you from the bottom of my heart. If anybody wants to rep the Dancing Toaster around their city, head on over to the merch store. Get some Dancing Toaster gear at thedancingtoasterstore.printful.me. But no matter what, I love you, and I'm grateful to all of you. Please share the show. Sharing the show is free. Telling others about it is free. Those things help in a big way. They feed the algorithms. They let other people know the show is worth checking out. Somebody reached out to me this week and said they were new to the show. They said they love blurry creatures, and they got all the way caught up with their episodes, which, by the way, is no small feat. But then they reached out and said that they'd love to see me on there one day talking with Nate and Luke, and they also mentioned Joel Mutamale, and I said I'd love to be on their show someday too, but I don't think I am smart enough or interesting enough to go there. I'm no expert in anything, just a simple pastor and church planner who loves teaching, who loves the strange, and who loves storytelling. I want to see Christians open up to the supernatural, and I want the lost to be found, and I feel the supernatural is good soil to plant seeds in.
Okay, we get it. Can you shut up and get started now?
You are so rude. Why do you have to ruin the moment? No, I'm not going to shut up. Before getting started, I have one more set of thank yous to issue, sir.
Good night. night. We're gonna be here till Christmas.
Well, then cork it and get some eggnog, all right? Anyways, the last set of thank yous as I reflect on our 1-year anniversary is a thank you to all the shows that have allowed me on to talk about my show and the things that I love. Flows for You was the first brother to allow me to be a guest. Thank you, Jason, for that. Thank you, my dear friends at the Unrefined podcast who had me on to talk about Ed and Lorraine Warren. To my dear brothers on the Dangerous Info podcast, thanks for allowing me to join you and talk about the Book of Enoch and the supernatural worldview of the Bible. Christina from Sasquatch and Sourdough, thank you, sis, for allowing me to kick off the summer with you and talk about the Ghostbusters and all the weird and wonderful things involved in that. Speaking of Ghostbusters, a big thank you to PJ from Real Conspiracies for allowing me to join you and talk about my favorite movie of all time, Ghostbusters, of course. That was my most recent opportunity. And my dear brothers over at Nevermore Hollows, don't think I forgot about you. Thank you for the amazing times we've been able to hang out and talk about storytelling and all things weird and wonderful. Go check out their most recent episode of Nevermore Hollows because there is a special character that has been introduced to the town. I'm pretty excited about that, and I want to thank you guys so much, Alan. It means a lot, and Chris, I can't wait for us to fellowship once again. You guys are a blessing. And last but certainly not least, thank you, Bo, from the Bump podcast. So many of the people that are listening to the Dancing Toaster today first heard about it from you, and I'm so glad to have that honor. I'm pretty sure that's everybody. If I forgot you, charge it to my head, not my heart. I'll make sure to thank you on the next one. You guys have all made this journey so much better. I never imagined being able to connect and meet with so many incredible men and women when I started a year ago. I wasn't sure if anybody was even gonna care, but you guys did. So thank you. And thank you guys. You are listening to this right now. Thank you. I mean, from the bottom of my heart. There are so many shows you could be listening to. So allowing me to be a part of your week is an incredible privilege. And, man, thank you.
All right. Can you please shut up and get started? I need to know what's going on in Bedbug.
Oh my gosh, you're just as bad as the dog, ruining the moment. And it's Bedburg.
What'd I say?
Bedbug.
There's no way. My Nona had a bedbug scare once. Turns out the cat had fleas.
Was it her cat?
No, it was my cat. That's why she strongly suggested that I move to the basement.
You never mentioned your cat.
That's because he ain't mine no more. Cannoli moved on to a better place.
Oh man, I'm so sorry your cat passed away.
Nah, he didn't pass away.
But you said he went on to a better place.
Yeah, my Uncle Sal's cannoli moved there after my Nona said she was sick of him bringing dead mice in the house. I tried to explain that it was just him showing affection, but she wasn't having it. She wasn't feeling the love, so she packed his bags.
Cannoli had luggage?
Oh, yeah.
Please, for the love of all that is holy, both of you shut up about cannolis and thank yous and just get started with the daggum episode. Gosh.
Oh my, you're probably right, Doc. Oh, let's get some background concerning our setting for today. In the 1500s, Bedburg was a small but significant farming town in the electorate of Cologne, a part of the Holy Roman Empire. It sat along the Erft River in what's now Western Germany, not far from Cologne itself. Life there was rural, quiet on the surface, but beneath it the century was anything but peaceful. The region was torn between faiths. The Reformation had split Europe open, and the Rhineland became a patchwork of Catholic and Protestant territories constantly at odds with one another. Bedburg lay under the authority of the Catholic Archbishop of Cologne, but Protestant ideas were spreading fast through nearby towns. This tension created an atmosphere thick with paranoia, heresy trials, and witch hunts. People were quick to see the devil's hand in misfortune, disease, or crime. A bad harvest or missing child wasn't just tragedy. It was often interpreted as proof of Satan's work. Economically, Bedburg's people were tied to the land. Farming, herding, and milling were daily life. Winters were harsh, medical knowledge primitive, and superstition filled the gaps left by science. Wolves roamed the forest, and the fear of them, real or imagined, became part of the collective psychology. Rumors of werewolves or witches could travel faster than facts. When Peter Stump's alleged crimes came to light in the late 1580s, Bedburg was already on edge. The 30 Years' War hadn't begun yet, but the religious climate was ripe for hysteria. The authorities, both civic and ecclesiastical, saw themselves as guardians against evil. So when the mutilated bodies appeared and the whispers pointed to something inhuman, it didn't take long for fear to turn into a witch hunt.
Don't you mean werewolf hunt?
Figure of speech, Vinny, figure of speech.
Oh, okay, got it.
In short, Bedburg in the 1500s was a crossroads of faith and fear, a farming town haunted by war, wolves, and whispers. The people lived close to the earth and closer still to their superstitions. In that world, a man like Peter Stumpp didn't just become a murderer. He became a monster.
October 31st, 1589. The air in Bedburg tasted like iron and rain. The kind of night where even the moon wanted nothing to do with what was about to happen. Peter Stumpp stood accused of mass murder. No, worse, mass horror. 25 years of blood, bone, and superstition had led to this moment. They said he took pleasure in killing, that he found joy in watching the light fade from the eyes of his victims. Men, women, children, livestock, they say it didn't matter. If it bled, it belonged to him. The villagers said he wasn't just a murderer. They claimed he was something else. Something that didn't walk upright unless it wanted to. They claimed Peter Stumpp made a pact with the devil himself. Not a metaphor. Not a warning about sin or temptation. A real deal, signed in blood, sealed in darkness. According to his own confessions, he traded his soul for a belt, black as Satan's shadow, forged in hell's furnace. A relic that could turn a man into a beast. Not the kind that howls at the moon, but the kind that makes the moon afraid to look down. When he wore it, the stories say his bones cracked, his skin split, and something unspeakable came crawling out. A creature with claws sharp enough to carve through innocence. A snout slick with the scent of fear. He prowled the forests around Bedburg, where the fog moved like breath through the pines and trees seemed to pray for dawn. He hunted the weak, the wandering, and the unlucky. He feasted on flesh, human and otherwise. They said he lay with demons, that he tasted blood until whatever was left on the man beneath the monster drowned in it. Even his own son wasn't spared. His mind consumed, his skull cracked open like a warning to the rest of the world. When they finally caught him, he confessed to everything. But confession doesn't mean much when the rack is speaking through you. Bedburg wasn't looking for truth. Truth was a luxury, but fear was the law, and fire was its justice. They broke him on the wheel, tore his flesh with red-hot pincers, took his head before throwing what was left into the fire. The crowd came to see a monster die, but what they really came for was redemption. They needed to believe that evil could be burned away, purged, even if the flames were their own reflection. But Peter Stumpp hadn't always been the Wolf of Bedburg. Once he was a man, a farmer, a father, someone who blended into the dull rhythm of the village. Another name, another face in the mud. He walked the same streets as the ones who would one day cheer his execution. Born around 1530, when the Reformation still tore through pulpits and families alike, he learned early that faith could be both a banner and a blade. The air of that time was thick with sermons and suspicion. The forests north of Cologne were his escape, a world of silence and shadow that didn't demand confession. It was there, they say, that the boy first reached through the darkness. 12 years old, dirt under his nails, already dreaming of power. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe desperation, or maybe the devil whispered his name through the trees. The stories say he began to practice sorcery, learn the dark arts, and forged a bond that followed him like a ghost through the years. Whether it happened or not, no one can say for sure, but Bedburg believed it. And belief, well, belief is the most dangerous kind of magic there is. We know his story because of the pamphlets, the tabloid scripture of the 16th century. Thin sheets of cheap paper, soaked in ink and hysteria, passed from one frightened hand to another. They were the social media of their age, spreading fear faster than fire in a dry field. These broadsheets carried news of monsters, witches, and sinners whose fates promised that justice still had teeth, even if mercy no longer did. They called them wahrhafte Beschreibungen, true accounts. But truth was a matter of perspective, and terror sold better anyway. ancient clickbait. Printed in cramped Gothic letters, each page told of Stump's crimes with the rhythm of a sermon and the thrill of a confession. You could buy them in taverns, outside churches, in crowded marketplaces where the scent of sweat, smoke, and rumor mixed with the ink. Every page promised revelation, every sentence stoked the fire of a public desperate to believe that evil had a face, and that face had been burned away. One London printer called it a thing to breed incredulity in the hearts of all men, but disbelief never stopped anyone from reading. They devoured every line, clutching the pages like talismans, whispering the name Peter Stumpp as though it might summon or banish something in the dark. The story crossed borders, languages, and pulpits. It became a kind of gospel for the damned, a grim reminder that even the devil had his scribes. By the time the press cooled, Stumpp was no longer a man. He was a curse, a ghost made of rumor and repetition, a bedtime story for a world too haunted to sleep, where every shadow might still wear his grin. That Halloween of 1589 hung over Bedburg like a shroud of rot and judgment. Somewhere between the living and the damned, Peter Stumpp met his end. They say the flame swallowed him whole, but fire can't purify what's already burned black inside. Before the blaze, the executioner's axe came down, and history exhaled one last breath over a man who feasted on the screams of his own kind. The records call his crimes vast. That's a polite word for horror too wide to measure. The truth bled through old parchment like ink on a corpse's skin, the full tally of his victims still unknown. A 16-page English translation of one of those German pamphlets contained his confession, or maybe the devil's greatest ghostwriter. Stumpp claimed the darkness got to him young, that black magic seeped into his bones before he ever knew what innocence meant. When others prayed for fortune or glory, he prayed for permission to hate, to harm, to turn cruelty into craft. He said he didn't ask for riches or renown. He only asked for the power to unleash his malice, to tear through flesh and faith alike in the form of some beast unbound by fear or mercy. They say Satan listened, offered him a gift wrapped in damnation, that cursed girdle. No ordinary belt, but a strip of hell's own leather. When he wore it, Peter the man dissolved. In his place stood a wolf, hulking, ravenous, and blasphemously alive. Eyes like twin embers, paws heavy as hammers, a mouth built to unmake creation, every tooth a sermon of pain. When he removed it, he became human again, though human feels generous. And so, armed with his infernal keepsake, Stumpp began his reign of terror. Farmer by day, bloodthirsty fiend by night. Vengeance was his gospel. When someone crossed him, he'd don the girdle and hunt them down beneath the moon's cold eye, waiting until they were alone. Then he'd strike. Throats torn open, limbs scattered like harvest refuse. One account claims he hunted 3 at once, 2 men and a woman. The men were found later mangled beyond mercy. The woman vanished entirely. The pamphlets say she was devoured whole, her flesh, quote, sweet and dainty. The words get worse from there. Children, pregnant women. He tore unborn lives from their mothers, devouring hearts and trembling. Dainty morsels, he called them, as if damnation required poetry. But hunger's a cruel master. It doesn't stop. They said he turned on his own son, dragging the boy into the woods. There, wearing the girdle, he split him open, consumed his brains right out of his skull. The unthinkable. A father feeding on his own bloodline. A wolf that had forgotten it was ever a man. For years, the countryside bled under his shadow. Arms and legs surfaced like driftwood after a storm. Livestock gutted, carcasses steaming in the dawn frost. Most blamed common wolves. It was easier that way. Easier to believe in nature's cruelty rather than man's. The people learned to stay indoors after sundown. Lanterns snuffed early. Made sure to travel in groups. If a child went missing, hope was the first thing that was buried. The beast had claimed another. And somewhere in the dark, between the crack of bone and the gnash of teeth, Peter Stumpp smiled. A man who traded his soul for the joy of tearing creation apart. For 25 years, this nightmare refused to die. The land around Bedburg lived under a curse that bled through generations. A wound that festered every time the moon climbed high and the cattle grew restless. The people tried everything. Hunts, traps, prayers whispered through clenched teeth, but no wolf was ever caught. Yet the beast was always seen. Always just beyond the torchlight. A rumor that breathed. A shadow that remembered. One pamphlet out of London told of a girl who got too close to the story. She was just a child, playing in a meadow with friends. Then the world changed shape. The wolf came out of the tall grass like sin with legs. It moved fast, too fast for something of that size, a blur of fur, rage, and hunger. Before she could scream, it had her by the collar, jaws locked, teeth scraping for her throat. But fate and fabric intervened. Her dress was thick that day, woven tight enough to keep death waiting. The creature couldn't finish the kill. Her friends cried out, their fear echoing across the field. It startled a nearby herd of cattle, and panic did what courage couldn't. The animals thundered forward, horns flashing, hooves churning the earth like divine judgment. The beast was struck, thrown off balance, swallowed in the chaos. Then, like all nightmares, it vanished into the woods. The young girl lived, but the terror stayed behind, stitched into Bedburg's collective memory like a scar that would never fade. The children ran home screaming, dragging the story behind them like a trail of blood. That night the men gathered once again, pitchforks, muskets, torches, classic mob. It was a ritual by then, an act of desperation disguised as duty. They hunted shadows before, but this time something different hung in the air. Rage, exhaustion, the kind of fury that doesn't care what it hits as long as it hits something. According to the pamphlets, they kept hounds trained and waiting, animals bred for vengeance, kept hungry for the scent of sin. And then, by what the pamphlet called God's good pleasure, the creature was seen again. Its shape prowling the edge of the forest, just beyond where the light gives up. The hunters pursued, hearts pounding in rhythm with the hound's snarls. The air was thick with the promise of blood. The chase continued. Branches broke. The ground tore beneath their boots. The hounds bayed like the damned. Steel caught the moonlight, silvered and sharp. The beast fled through the woods, a black streak of muscle and nightmare, and the men followed until their lungs burned and their souls ached. Then, just as suddenly as it began, it was over. They reached a clearing where the wolf had vanished. Only a man stood there now. That man was none other than Peter Stumpp. Calm, breathing hard but not afraid. He held a walking stick like a man out for an evening stroll, as if he hadn't just been chased by half the town. The men froze. They had followed the beast the entire way. They had seen its shape, its movement, its glowing eyes, but now only Stumpp remained. No fur, no blood trail. Just the faint smell of smoke and iron. In that silence, something inside them cracked. The fragile barrier between myth and man gave way. The conclusion came easy. Peter Stumpp must be the beast. They didn't need proof. They had fear, and fear doesn't need evidence. It just needs a direction. They dragged him back to town, the hounds still barking like they cornered the devil himself. By the time they crossed the village square, the whispers had turned to chants, the story already rewriting itself as they walked. Peter Stumpp wasn't a neighbor anymore. He was the thing that haunted their dreams for 2.5 decades. When they brought him before the magistrate, some say superstition dressed itself as law. They didn't want testimony. They wanted closure. That was the night Bedburg stopped fearing the wolf and started fearing the man. October 28th, 1589, the gavel came down like the sound of judgment itself. Peter Stumpp, Farmer, father, fiend was found guilty of mass murder in the likeness of a wolf. 16 named victims, dozens more unaccounted for. The court didn't need numbers. The story had already written itself in dirt and blood. 3 days later on Halloween, justice arrived wrapped in iron and flame. They tied him to the wheel, the crowd pressing close enough to taste the smoke of his damnation. The executioners came prepared, burning pincers, a sword, and an axe. They tore the flesh from his body one piece at a time, breaking his limbs with the flat of the blade until bone and soul gave way. When there was nothing left to break, they took his head. A German broadsheet recorded the sentence. Because he led a wolf's life, one burned the body afterward. That was mercy in their eyes. Fire to seal a grave no priest would bless. When the ashes cooled, they built a monument to his damnation. A wooden wolf on a pole, and above it, the severed head of Peter Stumpp, mouth frozen mid-scream. A warning to anyone tempted to dine or deal with the devil. Artists came next. Woodcuts, more pamphlets and broadsides, illustrations of the wheel, the pincers, the beheading. Europe devoured the story like gossip from the pit. The Werewolf of Bedburg, they called him. The name stuck for centuries, burned into the margins of history where monsters and men blur together. The trial records were simple. He was found near one of the murders. Witnesses swore against him. Their names listed in the 1590 pamphlet like signatures of faith and fear. But when the ink dried, most of the story came from Stumpp himself, or at least from his screams. After his capture, they put him to the rack, twisting truth out of bone. They threatened more pain, and suddenly the stories flowed, a confession that spanned 25 years of horror. Torture has a way of turning men into poets of their own destruction. Under enough agony, a man will confess to killing the sun. Yet many said Stumpp's confession went too far. It was too detailed, too depraved to be simple invention. He spoke of the sweet and dainty taste of women and children, of unborn hearts eaten raw, still pulsing with life, of his own son, his heart's ease, whose brains he claimed were too delicious to resist. That wasn't confession. That was theater. Pride through pain. A man narrating his own fall from grace like it was scripture. And the pattern back then, it was always the same. The devil's pact, the trinket of transformation, the relic that turned man into monster. It wasn't the first time Europe had heard this song, and it wouldn't be the last. Every village had its werewolf, every sinner his satanic gift. But in Bedburg, the line blurred so completely that maybe even Peter Stumpp forgot which side he was on. They burned his body to make sure the wolf stayed dead. But stories don't burn. Stories howl.
So, we're supposed to believe a farmer in the Rhineland made a deal with the devil for a belt that turned him into a wolf?
Hey, don't roll your eyes, Doc. You heard the details. The man confessed. He said he wore the thing, turned hairy, went hunting under the moonlight like some kind of medieval Jason Voorhees.
He also confessed while being torn apart on the rack, Vinny. Under that kind of persuasion, I'd probably admit to sinking Atlantis or stealing the Ark of the Covenant. Torture doesn't find truth, son. It manufactures it.
Yeah, but come on. 25 years of people vanishing, kids getting mauled, pregnant women getting ripped open. You don't fake that. You don't bite your own kid unless something's possessing you.
Or unless something's collapsing around you. The late 1500s were pure chaos. The Reformation had split the church. Catholic towns were accusing Protestant ones of witchcraft, and everyone was terrified that Satan was behind the next plague or storm. Fear makes easy targets, and Peter Stumpp was perfect. Loner, widower, older, maybe strange enough to make people uneasy.
So you're saying they just picked a weird farmer and called him the devil's lapdog?
I'm saying he was a scapegoat, Vincent, in a system addicted to fear. Those pamphlets that spread his story, think of them like 16th century tabloids. They sold sin, suffering, and salvation all in one sheet. Sadly, the church and the state both used them to keep the masses scared and obedient. Every werewolf trial was really a witch trial in fur.
Come on, that still don't explain how people saw him change, though. Whole mob swore they chased a wolf and caught a man. You think all those folks was lying?
No, I think they were human. I think hysteria can be contagious. One person swears they saw glowing eyes in the dark, another adds claws, and before you know it, you got a monster instead of a murderer. Bedburg didn't just burn a man, they burned a myth into memory.
So you're saying the real beast wasn't Stumpp?
I'm saying the real beast was fear. It had the whole town by the throat.
Yeah, maybe, but sometimes fear's the only thing that knows when something evil's in the room.
Slow down, fellas, slow down. You both make some good points. Dr. Wright's not wrong. Fear was the air people breathed in the 16th century. It crept through every pulpit, every confession booth, every candlelit street corner. It was a time when the devil wasn't a distant threat. He was the neighbor you couldn't quite see but always suspected. And Vinny, you're right too. Evil isn't just a metaphor or a bedtime story for the superstitious. It's real and it's ancient. The mistake we make, both then and now, is thinking it only wears one face. Evil isn't just red skin and horns. Sometimes it looks like us. Doc's right that hysteria ran rampant during the Reformation. Europe was a continent at war with itself. Faith had become a battlefield. Catholics accused Protestants of heresy, and Protestants returned the favor. Each side saw the other as serving a different master. And while they fought over who owned the truth, both turned their fury inward, branding their own neighbors as witches, heretics, and servants of the devil. It was an age where theology and terror shared the same vocabulary. And caught in the middle were frightened people looking for someone or something to blame. But the question that always gets missed is why the hysteria took the shape that it did. Why wolves? Why demons? Why did they choose the language of transformation to describe what they feared?
You know, people back then didn't have the language we do for the mind. They didn't understand trauma or psychosis or what constant fear can do to a person. When they saw cruelty or madness, they reached for what they did understand: evil. And evil to them had to look like something, so they gave it fur and fangs. I don't think it was mockery or blasphemy. I think it was desperation. If you can name the monster, you can contain it. If evil turns a man into a wolf, then evil has boundaries. You can see it. You can chase it. You can burn it. And then you can believe the world's safe and clean again. But the harder truth is that evil doesn't always wear a shape. Sometimes it hides in plain sight behind ordinary faces. And that's harder to hunt.
Yeah, but what if that's not the whole story, Doc? You keep calling it projection, but there's a reason the same kinds of stories show up everywhere. Every culture on the planet's got tales of people changing. Wolves in Europe, leopards in Africa, tigers in Asia, skinwalkers out west. You really think that that's all coincidence? I don't. I think it's memory, pattern recognition, people seeing the same shadow cross their campfire from different corners of the world. Maybe they didn't have the words for it, but they knew something real was happening, something that twisted people from the inside out. You cross a line spiritually, I think it marks you. You step out of the light long enough, and you can start reflecting whatever's in the dark. It's like people instinctively understood that the more you worship something corrupt, the more it rewrites you to look like it. Different languages, different gods, same story. The world's been watching the same transformation happen for centuries. It just changes costumes like Halloween.
You know what's interesting? You're both circling the same truths from different directions. Doc, you see the psychology, the way fear and ignorance force people to give shape to what they didn't understand. And Vinny, you're sensing a pattern, the spiritual residue that keeps showing up in every culture, like the world's been haunted by the same shadows under different names. What both of you are describing in different languages is the same thing Scripture's been saying since the beginning. Sin is more than wrongdoing. It's also a decreation of sorts. It unravels the order God built into us. God made man in His image to rule creation, to stand between heaven and earth as His reflection. But when that image gets corrupted, man starts resembling the very thing he was meant to rule. Genesis 3 shows that descent. Eve listening to a beast instead of commanding it, Adam following her, forfeiting the authority they were given. And that pattern keeps repeating. Daniel 4 turns into a living parable when King Nebuchadnezzar's pride drags him down to the level of a beast. We'll come back to that in a bit. Romans 1 says the same thing in moral terms. When people reject God, He gives them over to the desires that consume them. The further we drift from the Creator, the more creature-like we become. That's why transformation became the language of fear. On some level, humanity knows that when we turn away from the image of God, we don't just sin. We change. We stop reflecting heaven and start mirroring the darkness we serve. The old stories of wolves, leopards, and demons aren't just folklore. They're parables of what happens when the divine image erodes and the beast underneath starts to show. On top of all this, the Reformation was an age of transformation in and of itself, in more ways than one. The world itself was shifting beneath people's feet. Faith, politics, even identity were mutating faster than anyone could comprehend. Centuries of religious certainty dissolved almost overnight. The old rhythms of life, the familiar order of the church, the hierarchy of kings and priests, all of it fractured. Europe wasn't just arguing about theology. In a way, it was redefining reality. And in that chaos, stories of transformation exploded. Werewolves, witches, and demons became more than superstition. They were mirrors of a world that no longer recognized its own reflection. The werewolf was the perfect symbol for a continent tearing itself apart. It was the story of a man who looked human by day, but turned savage when the darkness fell. That's what the 16th century felt like. Civilized in daylight, monstrous by night. People didn't just fear wolves in the woods. They feared the wolf within, the loss of self, the collapse of moral and spiritual order, the slow erosion of what made them human. When truth started bending to power and faith became a tool of politics, transformation stopped being a story. It became a symptom. The world itself was shifting form, and everyone could feel the ground moving beneath their souls. The Reformation was chaotic, but beneath the theology and politics, it exposed something far older and more universal. What fear does to faith. When truth splinters, people cling to symbols to make sense of the wreckage. In that age, transformation became the grammar of both fear and faith, the way humanity tried to describe what sin does to the soul. Every civilization has spoken of it. The Greeks warned of men devoured by their appetites, cursed to wear the forms of beasts. The Norse sang of warriors who surrendered their humanity to the fury of battle. In Africa, stories of leopard men told how dark power could turn justice into bloodlust. And among the native peoples of the Americas, tales of skinwalkers whispered that crossing certain spiritual boundaries meant losing yourself entirely.
You know, you still ain't even talked about skinwalkers yet.
I know, Vinny, I will.
Hey, you promised.
I said I will, chill. Anyways, different continents, different names, but the same warning echoes through them all. When man crosses the moral and spiritual line, he doesn't just fall, he changes. He stops reflecting heaven and starts mirroring hell. In part, the face of the beast is simply the face of man without God. That's why the werewolf endures. It isn't just folklore, it's a confession, a sermon wrapped in fur. A parable about what happens when the image of God is traded for the instincts of the flesh, when the soul, once meant to rule creation, becomes ruled by the beast within.
So what you're saying is nobody wakes up a monster, it's more like a slow morph thing. Little compromise here, little sin there, and the next thing you know, you're howling at the moon?
Something like that, Vinny. Transformation is the perfect metaphor for temptation. No one becomes a monster overnight. It happens gradually, choice by choice, until the line between man and beast disappears. The 16th century didn't have Freud, psychology, or trauma theory. They had wolves in the dark, but their stories carried the same warning Scripture gives us. If you feed the flesh long enough, it'll start to grow fangs.
That ain't in the Bible.
The Bible never hides from the truth that men can become beasts. It doesn't sugarcoat what pride, rebellion, and unchecked sin do to the human soul. Scripture gives us more than moral lessons, it gives us portraits. One of the clearest in the Bible is King Nebuchadnezzar. In chapter 4 of Daniel, the most powerful man on earth stands on his palace roof and he boasts, "Is not this great Babylon that I have built by my mighty power for the glory of my majesty?" It's the language of a man who's forgotten where his breath comes from. God gives him a moment, a warning and a dream that he ignores, and then judgment falls. In an instant, the crown means nothing. The king who thought himself divine becomes something less than human. His reason is stripped away, and he's driven into the wilderness like a beast that no longer belongs among men. For 7 years, Nebuchadnezzar eats grass like an ox. The dew of heaven soaks his back. His nails grow and curl like claws. His hair mats into wild tangles. He loses not only his throne, but his reflection, the very image of God he was made to bear. The humiliation wasn't punishment alone, it was revelation. God was showing the world and Nebuchadnezzar himself what pride really does. It's not just rebellion, it's regression. Sin drags a man backward away from image-bearer to instinct-driven beast. It doesn't merely make us bad, it makes us less. Less human, less whole, less like what we were made to be, what we were created to be. And that's the same tragedy echoing through the story of Peter Stumpp. You don't devour your own child unless something deep within you has rotted. Maybe he wasn't possessed by a snarling demon with fur and claws. Maybe the thing that took him over was the same kind of evil Scripture warns about. The slow possession of pride, hatred, lust, and cruelty. The kind of evil that doesn't roar, but whispers. It doesn't need to break down the door if you've already left it unlocked. So whether Peter Stumpp was under Satan's thumb or crushed beneath the hysteria of his age, the result was the same. A man stripped of humanity and a town feeding on fear. When people lose sight of God, they stop confronting the beast within and start hunting monsters within others. Fear becomes a mirror, and the reflection always looks a little too familiar. Maybe the story of Bedburg isn't really about a werewolf at all.
Maybe it's about the furry friends we made along the way.
Shut up! Maybe the story of Bedburg isn't really about werewolves at all. Maybe it's about what happens when the image of God gets devoured by the creature underneath. When the conscience dies and appetite takes command. That's not just folklore. That's theology. That's the Genesis 3, Daniel 4, Romans 1, woven together in blood and history. The story of a man who forgot heaven in a town that thought fire could burn away its own reflection.
All right. That's all good and well. But what about the whole devil's belt thing that gave Peter the power to transform? You talked about King Nebuchadnezzar whatever, but his transformation don't sound like it was by choice.
Great observation, Vinny. Nebuchadnezzar's transformation wasn't by choice. It was the judgment of God.
Yeah, and the dude ate grass and not human flesh.
Another great point. God brought King Nebi low to show him who really sat on the throne. But Peter Stumpp's story, if we take his confession at face value, is something very different.
I already told you his confession was made under duress.
Nah. They said it was too detailed to be made up.
Let's entertain it for a moment. His transformation, at least how it was told, was by choice. That's what makes his darker. He didn't stumble into the wilderness, he walked there willingly. The so-called devil's belt or girdle wasn't just a cursed object, it was a symbol of consent, a deal, a trade between the human and the inhuman. In Scripture, Satan never forces anyone into darkness. He bargains for it. Is that not what he did to our Edenic ancestors? He offers power, knowledge, or pleasure in exchange for worship and a corruption of the image we bear. If Stumpp's story is even partly true, that belt represents what happens when a man wraps himself in sin on purpose. It's not about leather and magic, it's about surrender. About taking what belongs to God, the body, the will, the image, and letting the enemy reshape it. Nebuchadnezzar's beastly state ended when he looked up and acknowledged heaven and the ruler of it. But Stumpp's so-called transformation began when he looked down, when he stopped seeing himself as accountable to anyone above him. One man was humbled and restored, the other was consumed. The difference between judgment and damnation is choice. And the devil's belt, real or not, is the perfect picture of that.
Wait a minute. But the belt is real, right? I mean, when they caught him, they must have grabbed that thing first and it must be chilling in some museum, right? I mean, don't tell me the Warrens got it.
Do you want to tell him or do you want me to?
You're acting a little too smug for my liking, so I'll tell him. The infamous belt that Peter Stumpp supposedly got from the devil and used to transform into a wolf was never found. And that missing artifact became one of the earliest and most obvious fractures in his story. Every surviving 16th century source, including the 1590 English pamphlet, A True Discourse Declaring the Damnable Life and Death of One Stube Peter, and the now lost German original it was based on, records the same detail. After Stumpp's confession, the authorities searched for the belt. They scoured his home, they scoured the fields and the woods around Bedburg, but nothing surfaced. According to the pamphlet, the explanation offered was chillingly simple. Quote, "The devil who had lent it to him took it again into his own keeping."
Oh, how convenient. Satan let Peter borrow his wardrobe and took it back when he got caught. That line alone tells you all you need to know about the mindset of the time. When evidence failed to appear, superstition filled the gaps.
Nah, Doc. The missing belt don't disprove Stumpp's guilt. It confirms it.
What on earth are you talking about?
It makes perfect sense. The devil was covering his tracks. Didn't Toaster Boy say that the devil thrives in ambiguity? He loves the plausible deniability to make us look stupid. Think about it. If the belt had been found, then everybody could have pointed at it and said, "See, proof of the devil right here." That's not how he works. He don't leave souvenirs. He leaves question marks. He's like the Riddler. That's the whole trick. Keep it blurry, keep it debatable. Makes believers sound crazy and skeptics like you feel clever. You get two sides fighting over what's real while he's still sitting in the smoke laughing. The missing belt ain't a loose end. I say it's part of the play. The devil don't need to prove he exists. He just needs to make sure no one can agree about it. That's his camouflage right there.
You make some good points, Vinny. Satan and the Kingdom of Darkness do have a way of tempting us and then abandoning us once we've succumbed to the temptation, deepening our isolation and our guilt. But even in the late 16th century, some readers weren't fully convinced. There were whispers that the girdle might have been a fantasy born under torture or a detail added by pamphlet writers eager to sell a more dramatic tale. Modern scholars see it in the same way. Writers like Montague Summers, Carlo Ginzburg, and later historians of witchcraft interpret the belt not as a literal magical device, but as a symbolic object, a tangible representation of a spiritual contract. It was propaganda in leather form, a physical image of what happens when a man binds himself to darkness. So, historically speaking, some claim Peter Stumpp confessed to owning a black belt forged by the devil, granting him the power to transform into a wolf. But as Dr. Wright gleefully pointed out, the belt was never found, never seen, and never mentioned again outside of Stumpp's confession. Either way, authorities dismissed the absence as the devil reclaiming his property, an explanation that kept the legend alive long after Stumpp's ashes were cold.
No belt means a major part of Stumpp's testimony is now questionable. Why don't you enlighten us all on the other evidence that tied Peter to the crimes?
I knew you were going to go there, and stop being so smug. In truth, outside of his confession, there was almost no hard evidence that Peter Stumpp personally committed any murders. What existed was a perfect storm of fear, rumor, and as the good doctor pointed out, a confession ripped out under torture, but nothing that would stand in any credible court then or now. Everything we know about his supposed crimes comes from the handful of sensational pamphlets and the whispers of a terrified community. The so-called evidence against him came almost entirely from his own confession. The primary source is the 1590 English pamphlet mentioned earlier, a true discourse declaring the damnable life and death of one Stubbe Peter. According to that account, Stumpp confessed to 25 years of murder, witchcraft, and even cannibalism. He supposedly described hunting men, women, and children in the, quote, likeness of a wolf. He claimed to have eaten unborn children and mutilated livestock, and most famously, he said the devil had given him that black belt that granted him the power to transform. But none of this existed outside of his tortured testimony. Torture was a standard judicial practice under the Holy Roman Empire for extracting confessions in witchcraft and heresy trials. The doc isn't wrong that under that kind of agony, people rarely tell the truth. They tell their interrogators what they want to hear.
But hold on, did those pamphlet thingies talk about witnesses that testified against Stumpp?
Well, the pamphlets mention witnesses, but their testimonies were never actually recorded.
That's right, no names, no depositions, not a single forensic detail, just vague references to townsfolk who saw strange things or heard tell of terrible events. These were nothing more than frightened neighbors searching for somebody to blame. Bedburg had been ravaged by war, famine, and disease. Fear was the only thing spreading faster than plague. When livestock died or children vanished, it was easier to point to a monster than face the chaos around them. And despite all the talk of mangled bodies and torn flesh, no verifiable remains were ever tied directly to Peter Stumpp. There were claims of horrific murders, but no documented victims, no burial records that matched the accusations, no medical inspection or official report describing the supposed carnage. The horror existed only in hearsay and imagination.
It's hard to disagree with Dr. Wright in this regard. Many say what truly condemned Stumpp was not evidence, but timing.
Wrong place, wrong time?
Yeah, Bedburg was a pressure cooker of Reformation-era tension, Catholic authorities struggling to maintain power, Protestant movements spreading through nearby regions, and common folk trapped between the two. Stumpp, a widower, a Protestant convert, and a relatively well-off farmer, made a convenient target. Branding him a werewolf and a servant of Satan gave people something to unite against. And then he's found all alone in that field where they had supposedly chased the beast. His execution wasn't about justice, it was about control, and the record of that justice was itself propaganda. No official court documents survived from the trial, only the printed pamphlets published in London by Edward White, a man known for printing execution ballads and scandalous crime stories. The tone is lurid, theatrical, and moralizing, closer to tabloid horror than legal history. Vinny, you may not like this, but modern historians, again like Carlo Ginzburg, Rolf Schult, and Hermann Lubb, have all described the case as a textbook example of demonological hysteria dressed up as proof. In the end, the story of Peter Stumpp says more about the fears of Bedburg than the guilt of the man they burned.
Wait a minute. So you're saying I got duped again?
Well, not necessarily, Vinny. Like I said, truth has to matter, and we gotta go where the evidence takes us. And in this case, the absence of evidence is quite unsettling.
So they burned and beheaded an innocent man?
Well, that's what it's looking like, Vinny, but we don't know for sure.
Now, I hate to bring this up because it's one of the darker parts of the story, but what about Stumpp's kid? Wasn't that one of the victims? Like, how can you say it's not tied to him?
Well, the supposed death of Peter Stumpp's son remains one of the most disturbing elements of his confession, but like much of the Bedburg werewolf legend, it rests entirely on unverified claims rather than any recorded evidence. The story is horrific, but it was likely crafted to shock and terrify, not document truth. The only source that mentions Stumpp killing and eating his own son is that 1590 English pamphlet. In its lurid narrative, the author claims that Stumpp, being inflamed with extreme wickedness, murdered his child and did eat and devour his brains. The statement appears nowhere else, not in court documents, witness accounts, or even church records. It exists purely within the pamphlet's pages, with no corroborating evidence to support it. No burial record identifies his son, no testimony from neighbors describes such an atrocity, and no physical remains were ever mentioned or found. It was horror on paper, but not in reality. Torture confessions from this era often followed a predictable, gruesome arc. Once an accused person admitted to witchcraft or diabolic acts, interrogators would press for even greater blasphemies. The goal wasn't accuracy, it was escalation. Cannibalism, infanticide, and incest were common features in such forced confessions because they symbolized a complete rejection of both God and humanity. Trials like Stumpp's weren't legal proceedings so much as moral theater, public rituals of fear meant to reinforce religious control and social order. The addition of filicide, the killing of one's own child, was the ultimate act of inversion. It painted Stumpp not simply as a sinner, but as a creature beyond redemption, a man who had turned on his own bloodline. No independent record confirms that Stumpp ever had a son who died under suspicious circumstances. The only names we got are a daughter and a mistress, Sybil Stumpp and Catherine Trumpin. Sadly, both women were executed alongside him, strangled and burned. If a son did exist, his death went unrecorded by local clergy or civic authorities. More likely, the story was invented to complete the image of the perfect monster, a father devouring his own flesh as proof that he was no longer human. It was the kind of imagery that satisfied a terrified audience, not a court seeking truth. Yet even as fabrication, the story served a powerful symbolic purpose. In the Christian imagination, a father consuming his child represented the ultimate corruption of divine order, the total reversal of God's design for creation. It echoed the horror of ancient Molech worship where children were sacrificed in fire. Whether real or imagined, Stumpp's supposed act carried the weight of theological warning. It said to the public, this is what happens when a man gives himself over to the devil. He devours what he was meant to protect. The pro-choice movement is worse than any werewolf could ever be and has far more victims, over 63 million in the U.S. alone, from 1973 to 2022. These bloodthirsty feminists make werewolves look like Care Bears in comparison. In any case, we have no record of Peter's son, nor of his death by any means, natural or otherwise.
I mean, I'm glad to hear that a dad probably didn't eat his kid, but I'm still annoyed that you hit me with the bait and switch again.
I get it, Vinny. You're not wrong to feel that way. It's easy to feel duped when the story you thought was about a supernatural killer turns out to be a very human tragedy. But here's the thing. The deeper you dig into history, the more you realize the real horror isn't always in the fangs or the fur. Sometimes it's in the people holding the torches. The townsfolk didn't need a werewolf to make Bedburg bleed. They did it themselves. They built one out of fear, rumor, and religious hysteria. Peter Stumpp's story isn't just about what they believed. It's about what fear does when it becomes faith. They were convinced that if they could burn the monster, they'd purify the town. But fear doesn't purify, it consumes. It turns justice into spectacle and men into executioners. So maybe there was no devil's belt, maybe there was no transformation, maybe there was no sun, but there was a man broken on the wheel and 2 women strangled beside him, all to make the rest of the town feel safe again. Still, we can't dismiss transformation entirely because the Bible doesn't. You mentioned earlier, Vinny, that Nebuchadnezzar's story in Daniel 4 didn't sound like a choice, and you're right, it wasn't. But it was a transformation. God stripped him of his reason until he lived like an animal, eating grass, sleeping under the dew, and losing every trace of his royal pride. That wasn't myth. That was judgment. Scripture shows that when pride and rebellion take hold, a person can fall beneath their own humanity. That's transformation of the worst kind, when sin takes the throne where God belongs. And across cultures, we find echoes of that truth. The Navajo tell stories of skinwalkers, men who trespassed into forbidden power and were consumed by it. The Norse had their berserkers, warriors who gave themselves over to rage until it swallowed them whole. The Greeks told of men who became wolves under Zeus's curse, something we'll revisit in the future to be sure. These aren't just coincidences, they're cultural fingerprints of a universal truth. Cross certain spiritual boundaries, and something inside you starts to change. So maybe Peter Stumpp wasn't a werewolf in the literal sense. Maybe he never put on a magic belt and prowled the fields of Bedburg. But something still changed in that man, or at least in the people who believed the story. Whether through sin, fear, or superstition, the image of God got blurred. Humanity gave way to something animal, something driven by instinct and terror. That's the real message hidden in this legend. Monsters aren't always born in the dark. Some are made in the light when people trade truth for comfort and justice for control. Sometimes the devil doesn't have to show up with claws. He just whispers, "There's the monster. Burn him and you'll be safe." And that's when the real transformation begins, when fear replaces faith and then turns to fire. Bedburg wanted a monster it could point at. God wants hearts that will look up. Whether Peter Stumpp was a butcher or a byproduct of hysteria, the warning is the same. Sin does not just stain, it reshapes. The longer we feed it, the more it feeds on us until image bearers look like beasts and crowds mistake fear for righteousness. Daniel 4 ends with the king on his knees and his reason returns. That is the road back for any of us. Not fire, not the wheel. Repentance. When your flesh is howling on the inside, do not bargain with it. Starve it. Bring it to the cross. Let Jesus remake what sin tried to unmake. Today we talked about transformations. When someone submits to Christ, the transformation is not cosmetic, it is creation-level change. The old self dies with its crooked loves, and a new life rises that begins to desire what God desires. The old is gone, the new has come. The heart is softened, the mind is renewed, and the will learns obedience that feels like freedom. Shame loses its claim because the cross has spoken a better word. Habits that once ruled start to weaken as the Spirit writes new reflexes into the soul. Forgiveness replaces bitterness. Truth displaces lies. Worship dethrones self. This is not behavior modification. This is adoption. This is reconciliation and resurrection power at work in ordinary lives, turning image bearers into Christ-like servants who carry light into the dark world and leave the fragrance of grace wherever they go. My friends, I have been Nelly, and this has been the 41st episode of The Dancing Toaster. If you found our tale today interesting, share this episode. That's how people are going to find out about the show. Continue to share it with your friends who love history and the unexplained. If you want to help me continue to do these deep dives, join the Toasties on Patreon and help me keep the lights on. Links for everything, as always, are in the show notes. And as always, I want to thank you. Thank you for listening to The Dancing Toaster. Wherever you're listening, please like, share, subscribe, comment, leave a review, follow, do all the things wherever you consume The Dancing Toaster. But whatever you do, don't consume toasters, and don't let any angry villagers consume you. I love you. I'm out.
Report suspicious activities and call 911 for immediate response. Expect delay. Traffic delays and restrictions. Take personal security precautions to avoid becoming a victim of an attack. Avoid crowded public areas and gatherings. Do not travel in areas affected by the attack or in a known area of elevated virus government officials insisted that these have isolated and different of the packet for him. But then, perhaps we will continue to keep you informed of this story of